Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of CloudNativeFM podcast, and today we will talk about Open Policy Agent. The Open Policy Agent is used for policy decision making across the stack. In the case of Kubernetes, it is often used an admission controller to protect the API server with dynamic rules that don't require recompilation. Today in the CloudNativeFM podcast, I am joined by Anders Eknert, developer advocate at Styra Inc. Styra Inc. are the co-founder and the company behind Open Policy Agent. And hopefully I pronounce his name correctly, Anders Eknert. And today we will both talk about the project, including things like architecture, origin, community, the policy language Rego, and of course performance. The podcast is an introduction to how OPA can be used across the stack for policy decision making. So here are the takeaways from the OPAs. OPA responsibility is to make policy decision on its own and return that decision as a JSON object back to the caller. It's up to the caller to decide what to do with the OPA decision. Semantically, OPA only operates on the data passed to it, typically as JSON. So OPA doesn't require deep knowledge about the environment itself. This makes OPA flexible and portable to many different use cases. Another big advantage of OPA that it uses Rego. Rego is a high-level declarative language that based on decades of research into policy systems. It embodies specific ideas that make it useful for these kind of more modern cloud-native systems, and is designed like an onion. There are core parts of the language that are extremely fast, and as you need more expressiveness, you move up the performance curve. And also, OPA is most often used as an admission controller in Kubernetes. An admission controller is where all the semantic validation of Kubernetes resources occur before resources are persisted to etcd and controller go off and start doing work. So let's go ahead and say hi to my guest Anders Eknert, developer advocate at Styra Inc. and cut it over to the interview. For another exciting episode of CloudNative.fm. This is episode number 23. And today I'm really excited because I'm waiting for this day to help find some individual from Styra Inc. And we can talk about the Open Policy Agent. And I perfectly find the member who can describe all these kind of policy related things in Kubernetes. And his name is Anders Eknert. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it correct. And he's a developer advocate at Styra Inc., the company who made this tool, the renowned tool in the CNCF ecosystem, that is Open Policy Agent. Thank you very much, Anders, and glad to have you on the CloudNative.fm podcast. So let's introduce yourself to the community. So go ahead and introduce yourself to the community.
Thanks, Hayam. I'm Anders, and I work as a developer advocate at Styra. That's where the t-shirt is from. So, like you said, Styra is the inventors and the main, I'd say the main contributor behind the Open Policy Agent project. which is an open source project, and which is hosted by the Cloud Native Foundation. And yeah, OPA is a general purpose policy engine. That's what we do. Yeah, for people who are unfamiliar with OPA, or OPA is short for Open Policy Engine. I think that's a pretty common question. Like, first question, how is it pronounced? How do you say? Do you say OPA or do you say OPA? And yeah, the correct answer is you say OPA. So OPA is an open source general purpose policy engine. And the problem that a policy engine solves is pretty much codifying policy. So in any organization, you're gonna find policy, either organizational policy. It could be policy from the outside, like GDPR, or other kind of legal policy and so on. But most often it also entails authorization, like who gets to do what, or in the Kubernetes case, admission control, like what type of deployments are we going to allow, or what kind of rules do we want around our deployments or our pods or network policies and so on. So OPA doesn't really, the goal of OPA is to kind of cater to all these use cases. That's where the general purpose part of OPA really comes in. So there are other policy engines which kind of specialize on a single purpose, but the outspoken goal of OPA is to kind of cover any use case you might find where you need to enforce policy, whether it's organizational policy or if it's authorization or admission control. So that's basically OPA. And so policies are written in a declarative language called Rego. If you like encounter Rego for the first time, could be it could look somewhat foreign if you're used to like an imperative languages like Go or Java. It's rather a declarative language, sort of like SQL. So a query language, if you will. So that's basically what OPA is.
Yes, and thank you very much for helping me out how to pronounce it, because I usually call it OPA, and I've seen people are talking on the internet, on the Twitter side especially, they call it OPA, and I confuse they are talking about open policy agent or something else, because in the Kubernetes ecosystem there is so many ways you can pronounce the word, like kubectl, 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 and like OPA and OPA are really the same thing, whatever you like to pronounce it. So before we think we go ahead and talk about the open policy agent and policy things. So the first question I try to ask my members whenever they join the CloudNativeFM podcast. So what you like to be in the Kubernetes, how you switch to Kubernetes, how you find this community like CNCF, and what your experience of being in the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Right, yeah, that's a good question. And of course, even if OPA, like I said, it's general purpose, so you can definitely use OPA with or without Kubernetes. But yeah, I'd say Kubernetes is definitely a big part of OPA. Like most users deploy OPA in their Kubernetes clusters, either as for admission control. Again, to control what gets deployed and what can't be deployed, but also for microservice authorization, either through like Envoy, Istio, service mesh technologies, or just as a sidecar to your normal applications. So yeah, being part of the larger Kubernetes ecosystem is interesting. It's like Kubernetes is so big and complex, and I think having these kind of policies in place certainly helps in avoiding like common mistakes in deployments and in configuration. So I think that's OPA plays a big part in many organizations to kind of simplify or if not to simplify Kubernetes, then at least kind of provide these type of guardrails where even if you do something wrong, it's not gonna destroy anything, or things aren't gonna so you really can't do mistakes, because that's what the policy engine OPA will say no, or it's not gonna happen. You can't deploy, I don't know, a deployment in 600 replicas, because that's gonna be like way too resource hungry or expensive or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. I think because the larger ecosystem is revolving around cloud native and Kubernetes and these kind of things. And we all know right now, if we're living in the Kubernetes clusters, the Docker, the containers, this is a wonderful security related topics, because Kubernetes is not secure by default. They ask you to build those platforms that they can secure you. And also the container in general, if you work with the Docker, they're not a way of because you have this access to run as a privilege or the root user. So you can do anything as you want. So these are the things are really, really concerning for enterprises and the larger community and the larger ecosystem. How to guardrail these kind of resources that run on top of Kubernetes, and you need some kind of solution for that. And that's kind of, I think the first word came into my mind is that's called policy. So before we dive into the technology space, the first question that I ask myself and everyone who are in this space, what are the policies in Kubernetes? How you define the policies, what are their responsibilities are?
Yeah, no, I think you provided a pretty good example there of a good policy, what a good policy could do or mandate, which would be to disallow containers to be deployed running as root, or to ensure that with each deployment there's a corresponding network policy that by default denies outbound traffic or what have you. So those kind of guardrails are definitely useful. And there's a whole there's policy libraries, both like in the OPA open source project. There's this project called Gatekeeper or OPA Gatekeeper, which I'm sure is familiar to many, which is kind of almost like a distribution of OPA, which is specialized on Kubernetes admission control. And they have like a policy library that you can use. And that policy library contains the most common type of policies that you might want. But also there's, if you search GitHub, you're going to find policy libraries from a whole bunch of organizations and corporations. So there's really a whole lot of ready-made policies that you can find and deploy to your clusters without knowing like all the details of Rego or OPA. But of course, eventually it's good to know like what it is you're deploying. But you can deploy something and then kind of learn as you go. So yeah, you don't need to start from scratch. Since I think especially when it comes to admission control and these kind of Kubernetes guardrail policies, it's not like the needs are going to be that much different between all organizations. Like some of these things are pretty much universal. You're going to want to, you might want to enforce things like the security context in pods or containers, or have a cap on the max number of replicas or things like that. But and not just for security, but another pretty popular category of policies are those that enforce that the existence of certain labels or annotations, which is more like organizational policies, where you say that each deployment needs to have an owner or a team or something like that, or maybe a cost center. And that's not strictly security related, but it helps organizations to enforce that there aren't deployments where you don't really know who owns these deployments. And of course, that is also a security feature, since if you have resources deployed where there's no clear owner, then like who knows, or how do you patch that, or how do you know, like where do you go if something goes wrong? So yeah, even organizational policies kind of connects to security as well, I'd say.
Yes, absolutely. And previously I did talk to the, I think, Snake team, and we talk about these kind of things in the last webinar. And they are pointing out the wonderful direction, because we are right now living in the world where the boundaries are blurred between the teams. The devs don't know what they try to do, because dev is already building the infrastructure in part of their Docker file. So it's absolutely right now, it's mandatory for the teams to understand the policies you are running in the production stages. Because I think right now the Kubernetes 1.2021 is removing, I think 1.25, you completely remove the PSP, pod security policies. And right, they are now asking the community to build these kind of things, and they want some standard around it. So it's absolutely vital for the companies to do, because the boundaries are blurred, because dev are also writing the infrastructure as code and putting them in the GitHub, and the GitHub then clone this or sync this code, build the infrastructure, deploy an app on top of it. And you need to know what are the responsibilities, the RBAC of the teams now, what containers should do, how do containers, what are the system calls run inside of the container. So I think that's really important for everyone listening to us and using Kubernetes or elsewhere. In the policies is right now absolutely mandatory. You learn these, the responsibilities of policies and these kind of things. So next question, let's go to the, as we just talk about the developer. What is a developer life cycle if they want to adopt open policy agent? What is the developer life cycle for them to adopt if they are already using, or if they want to use open policy agent in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it depends somewhat on kind of what use case you start out with. Is it going to be for like application authorization or like those kind of policies? This is going to be for admission control or what have you. But I think like, I noticed you mentioned infrastructure as code as well, and that's another area where we've seen a lot of interest lately. Terraform policies or Pulumi or these kind of infrastructure as code platforms where it can be easy to make mistakes, and you'd also want these kind of guardrails that you had in the Kubernetes world for long. You're gonna want to bring those guardrails into your infrastructure deployments as well. So I think that for both like infrastructure as code and the Kubernetes admission control use case, it's normally part of the deployment pipeline. So whenever you do like a pull request or so, if it's for infrastructure as code, then you'd have like the plan file scanned and then run against your policy. So which might say that this is going to be way too expensive, or you can't deploy you can't create an S3 bucket without it being encrypted. Policies like that. So when you then submit that pull request with your change, the PR is going to say like this can't be merged because there's a violation of your policy here. So that would be like, I'd say that's the development, the common development life cycle, that you can do this checks on whenever you want to submit a PR. But of course, with the most recent trend is to kind of shift left in everything we do. So normally you'd also want to have some way of doing this locally before you even submit that PR, so that you know, like when you do, it's all going to be green and the PR can be submitted. So you could either create a plan file locally and scan that using like just OPA. There's another kind of side project in the OPA organization, or in the OPA project, which is called Conftest, which has this exact purpose, where you kind of scan local files on your file system against policy. And those files could be like Terraform files, they could be Kubernetes YAML resources, or they could be like INI files or any kind of configuration files you might have. So those tools help in kind of shifting left and enabling developers to run policies on their local machines before they run as part of the deployment pipeline. So I think that's the normal for these kind of guardrail style policies. Of course, if you're running OPA for authorization or app development, then that's going to be a different story altogether. And the way it normally works there is that OPA runs next to your application. So you have inside of your pod, you have not just one container, but two containers. You run your application and you run OPA next to it. So for any requests coming into your application, the application goes and asks OPA, should this request be allowed or not? And when your application asks OPA, it can provide any kind of data as part of that as part of that question, as part of the input. So you could, for example, provide the path of the request method. Is it like a GET request, a POST request, a DELETE request? But also user data. You could provide a JSON web token. This could be an OAuth access token or an OpenID Connect ID token, and then you can have OPA decode that, verify that, and then use that as part of its decision making. So maybe it would check what roles you have. Are you an admin or are you a regular user? And then use that data, and the response back to your application is just another JSON object. And that could either be like a Boolean value, like allow is true or false, but it could also be a more complex object. Maybe you want to provide a reason and display that back to the user. Like you can't do this because there's no admin on call, or you're not an admin, or there could be any number of reasons. But in some scenarios, it's a good UI or a good user experience to let the user know why the request was denied. So yeah, that kind of deployment looks fairly different from these guardrail policies, but it's all OPA in there, and we're all use Rego, like no matter what these no matter where you want to deploy your policies. And I think that's kind of the big strength of OPA, is that you have this one language where you can communicate policy, and you can offer policies using the same tools, the same language, and it's like the same knowledge that you have acquired so it's not like, okay, so now I want to do authorization, and then you have to go and learn a whole different language or a whole new policy engine or system. But there's really only one OPA and one language to express this. So even if there's maybe a slightly higher learning curve to learn OPA and Rego than some of these specialized policy engines or single purpose policy engines, I think it definitely pays off eventually as your need for policy as code grows inside of your organization.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot to unpack here, but I think the one thing that's really I learned today that if the open policy agent integrate with the GitHub, let's say you have a policy that they failed, then you reject that pull request because it's failing the policies. So that's number one. You are bringing the first hurdle. The things are deployed to the GitHub are those who are met the policy requirements. That's number one. That's great news for everyone who is listening to us. And the hats off to the team. Next, I think we have a shift left that you talk about, the GitOps model right now. You are pulling the code plus infrastructure in the GitHub, and then GitHub syncs that code from and builds out the infrastructure because the infrastructure is already written in the form of deployment, replica set, pod, ingress controller, and these Kubernetes objects. So that's the GitOps model is everyone practice now. So in those scenarios, let's say the GitOps scenario, how OPA integrate with these kind of things? Let's talk about the validation webhook, mutation webhook, so you can authenticate with the OPA and these kind of scenarios. So that's another good news because you can have a very mature cycle between these live requests of the API with the talking to Kubernetes. So that's another wonderful information for me, that they are also integrating with the GitOps model, because GitOps is every company is looking forward to, because we want, our infrastructure is already in the form of the YAML files. Why not use these YAML files to sync the code, desired actual state model, and that's really perfect. So that's another wonderful tool. Another do have explored is a Terraform or a Pulumi. It's integrated with these kind of tools that you build the infrastructure and you build these infrastructure on top of the policies, because you don't want, let's say, dev to create this testing cluster. You don't want your dev to create the production cluster, and you don't want your testing team to break the dev cluster. So these are the policies. These are really helpful, because if you don't have a really struggling path, who could decide what you could do with these kind of scenario, who's responsible for, and who's kind of these kind of things. So these are the very good detail that you are trying today. But I think the next question that's really important for us is right now, I think it's up to the choices for the people right now. I've seen there are people that are talking about the two different tools right now, but it's up to the people what they want to choose. Like say, I'm talking about the OPA versus the Kyverno, and we see the whole ecosystem is talking about which one to choose, which one to use. So I have talked to most of the team. So I have these things are for this scenario, but I think one of the best things I like about the OPA, that it's not just built in for the Kubernetes, because there is a huge community out there that are using the Terraform. There's a huge community out there. They are using some else tool like Pulumi and other tools. So we know the Kubernetes community is a huge, and they are also building out this tool. But the OPA integration with the infrastructure as code tool, that's really mandatory, because somebody created the S3 bucket and it's lying around for, let's say, 2-3 days or even 50 days. So it's providing a huge bill at the end of the month. So you can decide the guardrails. If somebody builds the S3 bucket and it's landing there for, let's say, 7 days or 8 days, and if somebody doesn't tear that up, so it's a policy already written for you, and somebody don't do that mistakenly. So that's a wonderful news. But I want your opinion to be, what do you see about these kind of, let's say, people talking about these two different schools of thoughts, for just for Kubernetes, and the tool integrate very well with Kubernetes, plus integrated other open source tools as well.
Yeah, right. So I'm obviously, I'm no expert on Kyverno or how that all works. I've tried it out, and I think I found it a pretty nice like policy engine for Kubernetes. So I'm not gonna wage any war here if that's what you wanted. I think they do a good job of for doing like simple policies for Kubernetes. And yeah, if that's the only like kind of use case you have for is Kubernetes admission control, like controlling what can and what can't be deployed to your clusters, like then yeah, obviously you should evaluate both and see which one you prefer. I think like what the philosophy they kind of bring to the table is kind of to use YAML for policies as well. And of course, I think the Kubernetes community is kind of split between people who like YAML and people who hate YAML.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I think for some people that's like a huge feature, and for others that's like, yeah, if they can avoid YAML, they're going to want to do that. So, but yeah, if YAML is your thing, and I think Kyverno could be a good choice as well. The most important part is that you have some form of policy in place. But again, of course, I'm obviously biased towards OPA, since that's where I come from. But and I think again, even I think it's pretty rare to have only even for like the platform teams or so that I have been working with, it's pretty rare that they only manage like Kubernetes admission control, but their responsibilities often range or include things like infrastructure. And of course, even if you run Kubernetes, like what do you do in your workloads? Like that's the big question, like, because you don't just run Kubernetes, you run something in Kubernetes. Like you run pods, you run applications, you run cron jobs, you run jobs. And so how do you use policy in those, like, or how do you get policy in there? So it might, even if you go with something like Kyverno for admission control, then you might still need OPA for other parts of your stack. So then I don't know if you can still like claim a big benefit then, because then you're still going to need to learn OPA, or you're still gonna so if you're only like if the only reason was to avoid OPA because it seemed more complex or more advanced, then you might still need that eventually. But
yes, absolutely. And I think one thing I see from the Kubernetes community and the rest of the ecosystem, some things like, let's say we say Rego is complex, Rego have a huge learning curve, OPA is a huge learning curve. We see later down the road, the tools are building up on top of it. They hide the complexity away from you, and you end up left up with the benefits that you are using with it. I've seen humongous amount of tools that are in the Kubernetes and the rest of the ecosystem that are built for those mindset to remove the complexity and build the benefit or use the benefit on most part of it. And I believe in the later down the road, we see these kind of tracks. Somebody builds some kind of tools that hide the complexity of Rego, and something else, and you just written 2 or 3 lines of code and the policy injected on top of it. Because I think that a lot of the criticism or a lot of the comments that people are talking about, that the OPA is using the CRD model. Every policy has a CRD, but at the end of the day, you don't write more than 4 or 3 lines of code for the policies. The policies are really shrink. They are just expressions. But the Rego expression is quite large. It's 200 or 300 lines of code. And people thinking about, we should avoid this, avoid or should adopt this. So as you mentioned, that's a wonderful, that's I think to draw the point that you use Kubernetes, let's say in the EKS, Amazon Cloud, you use Kubernetes, but you want to know how the Amazon Cloud works. Might be you use Kyverno for the Kubernetes, but you need to understand how to effectively not your bills are overcosted, and then you still need OPA. So it's a really a tough battle for everyone to choose which one or which one. I recommend, I think, to both learn both of these languages, and later down the road, you could decide better which one perfect in your scenario. So before I let you go, I think you cover very good amount of details on these kind of things. I want my listener to understand, let's say somebody isn't aware of OPA or Kyverno or Open Policy Agent, they doesn't even aware of that before that PSP are in the Kubernetes and they are now deprecated from 1.25. They don't aware of the Kubernetes policies, how they get started with it. Let's say for the OPA policy kind of things, how they get started using the OPA from tomorrow.
Yeah, right. So I think a good place to start is probably like the OPA Gatekeeper project. If you're interested in or curious about OPA for Kubernetes admission control, that's pretty a good like prepackaged software component that you can just like kubectl apply, install, and it's going to work pretty much out of the box. I should say though that like you don't really need to run OPA Gatekeeper, but you can run like just plain OPA as an admission controller as well, if you prefer that, and then you don't really use these kind of CRDs for deploying policy, but then you'd rather have like bundles where OPA goes and fetches policy from a remote endpoint. So there's a whole bunch of different like deployment options as well that you could evaluate, and of course there are also commercial options like from Styra and other companies. So yeah, there's a whole lot of options to choose from in OPA, but I think for admission control, OPA Gatekeeper is a good place to start. And I think also for these for the most simple use cases, as you said, and I think like this is something that goes with both like OPA and Kyverno, and like for the most common use cases, you're going to find these pre-written libraries and policies that you can just deploy, and they're going to work right out of the box. And so that's a good start. And then you can kind of learn as you go, try and read those, understand what's going on, and so on. And I think like if you need policies that are like hundreds of lines of codes, then it's probably because you're trying to solve a complex problem. And I think that's another key strength of OPA. Like if you have a complex problem, OPA and Rego is going to be there for you. There are really no limitations in terms of what you can do. Like, so yeah, it's a more advanced policy system, that's for sure, but it's also because it solves more complex problems than what you can do with like just plain YAML, for example. So yeah, depending on what you need, but again, if you only need to solve simple problems, then it doesn't really matter, because you could probably just find these pre-written policies and deploy them, just as long as you have a basic understanding of what's going on.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a best place to start the OPA is to follow Anders on the Twitter, because he's tweeting about these kind of things. He has a repo, I think, what a wonderful repo to get started with the OPA. I will later share with you if you're watching this from the YouTube, you can grab the link from it. So it's a wonderful place to start thinking about the policies and learning about OPA. And actually, I think that if you are already outside the Kubernetes ecosystem, let's say you're using Terraform or Pulumi or other kind of scenarios, then I think OPA is the only choice for you. There is not much out there for you. So you have to learn Rego and these kind of activities, because at the end of the day, it saves you a lot of money. It saves you a lot of money. And I think it's really a vital tool to have. And And also, I think it's works wonderful, works very fine with the Kubernetes as well. With the larger complex scenarios, you don't have other option to adopt because Kyverno is just for the simple use cases and OPA is for the advanced use cases. So I think you don't even you have to learn some point in the future if you already don't learning about OPA and the policies kind of thing. So the last question to Anders before we let you go is what next for the OPA later down the road? What do you think after the next 4 months? What's happening in the policy ecosystem? What's happening in the Styra company behind the OPA or the OPA? What's happening? And what's your plans for the next 4 months after the year closes?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question, and I feel a little like kind of rusty here because I've been on a paternity leave for the last month and a half here, so I'm not like really oriented in everything that's like been going on here. I know, like we talked about, there's been a lot of work for Terraform policies and infrastructure as code and kind of to have good coverage there in terms of like pre-written policies and so on. And there's a whole lot of like kind of side projects around the OPA community to work with that. But yeah, I don't really know, like for the next, for my own, I'm just hoping to be able to kind of go out on conferences and meetups and so on to be able to talk about OPA and give demos and kind of the things that I love. But yeah, we'll see how that turns out with like the Delta variant and so on.
Yes, absolutely. So one good news for you guys who are listening to us, we're teaming up with Anders, and hopefully in September of some time, we show you not only just in the Kubernetes, we try to show you how to run the policies outside of the Kubernetes, like Terraform or some other infrastructures too. So that's a really interesting section for you. If you aren't familiar with policies and policy infrastructure as code, how to manage policy in IAAC, we try to cover both scenarios with OPA. So you need to understand the power and flexibility of OPA. So I think you go out and go for the community.cncf.io/Islamabad. This is a place where we host a meetup. And later down the road, hopefully the September is a time frame where you see that Anders is talking to you again live. And this time it's not talking just, he's demoing out these OPA things with you. And hopefully you like about it. But I really enjoyed the conversation with him. And I've seen him, follow him for a very long time. Every time I want to learn some new thing about Rego, OPA, or policy, I try to engage with him on Twitter, follow him, and see what he's tweeting about. And when he sees some of the interesting things he tweeted about, I go and learn these kind of scenarios. So he's the person for you. Go follow him up, and his Twitter handle is available for you guys on the YouTube chat. Follow him, and he will help you get up to speed with policies. So thank you, everyone, guys, who are listening to us today. Hopefully, you learn a lot detail of policies, OPA, where it fits, what are the best use cases to adopt, why the policies are important, why do you care about it, and because you have to care about it, because Kubernetes 1.25, you won't see any policies unless you have OPA or Kyverno in your stack. So, Anders, thank you very much. I hope to see you in the future. Anders, bye-bye. Everyone, bye-bye.
Thanks, Zane.
Hey everybody, if you want to keep up what's going on in the cloud native ecosystem, we have a weekly podcast show on YouTube and SoundCloud by the name of CloudNative Islamabad. You can listen for free every single week. We try to find cloud and cloud native experts, share updates on cloud native best practices, cloud native real world use cases, cloud native deployment patterns, cloud native deployment strategies. Topics include AKS on Azure, EKS on AWS, GKE on GCP, cloud native architectures, cloud native application developments, container containerizing application, DevOps and automation, cloud native certification strategies, cloud native career tips, and more. So if that sounds awesome to you, head over to the SoundCloud and YouTube and subscribe to CloudNative Islamabad.